Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Festive Tech Calendar 2021. I'll be presenting Azure Landing Zone overview, and my name is Abdul Kazi. So let's do a quick introduction. As I mentioned, my name is Abdul Kazi. I've been in the IT industry for 20 years, very active in the Azure community. You can follow me on Twitter and connect with me on LinkedIn. And I have an active blog, and you can check out my blog for Azure related technical guidance. So let's talk about the agenda for today's session. So we'll talk about why cloud readiness environment are important. We'll talk about Azure Landing Zone from a cloud adoption framework. And then we'll go into the Azure Landing Zone design areas. There are multiple design areas. We would probably need a session for each design area. So if I look at networking, that is a session by itself. Or if I look at RBAC, role-based access control, that's a session by itself, just to cover all the details. Since this is an overview, I'm going to go through a high level of what these design areas entail, and I'll just talk about from a high level. Lastly, then we'll have the Azure Blueprints and then Azure Policy at the end. So let's jump into the value of cloud-ready environment. So why move to the cloud? So the biggest challenge right now people are facing is data is growing exponentially. People want to move to the cloud because they want higher resiliency. They want to move on a operational model. So if you think about it from a traditional on-prem environment, when you would buy any hardware, server, storage, networking gear, what have you, that would be on a capital expenditure, meaning you would buy it outright, and then depending on your company's financial policy, you would have depreciation for 3, 5, 7 years. And then after that, you would probably buy again. But cloud actually is totally different. Cloud model is more of a operational expense model. What that means is you only pay for what you consume, which sometimes it's a challenge by itself, because so we have gotten into the habit of paying a flat fee and getting all or let's call it buffet, if you will, pay one flat fee and then eat it all. So Netflix is a perfect example. Is you pay a flat fee and then it comes back to you with unlimited content. So you're not paying for other content. The challenge with cloud is because it is a consumption-based model, a lot of companies do not know how to control their cost, or when they go into the cloud, they don't have the right check and balances to control costs, control governance, control other things. So that's why you have to have a great plan of moving to the cloud, which leads me to the Azure Landing Zone in Cloud Adoption Framework. So what exactly is Cloud Adoption Framework? So Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework aligns different phases of the cloud to ensure easy access to the right guidance at the right time. The framework consists of multiple phases or pillars, if you will. There are 5 of them. So the first one is strategy. So you need to have a very solid, strong business case to move to the cloud, because otherwise you get a lot of pushback, because cloud is out there, but why move to the cloud? What is the business justification? your CFO, your finance people are always going to ask, okay, what is it for me? How are we going to save money? What's the value? What are we getting out of the cloud? We already have a system right now. We're already invested in the on-prem environment. Is that not enough? Excuse me. So there has to be a strong business justification, and that's where the strategy really comes in. Secondly, you need to have a plan. The plan for how you are going to be moving to the cloud. So there has to be a actionable adoption plan that needs to be created and aligned to the business strategy, to make sure that the plan really aligns to the business justification and the outcomes. The third is going to be ready state, which means that you are ready, or you're basically preparing to move to the cloud for the planned changes. And this is where the Azure Landing Zone really comes into play. So you're getting ready to start on the Azure journey from a environment standpoint. Then you have the adopt. So adopt has two phases. You have the migrate or innovate. So the migrate is mainly if you want to basically do a lift and shift move as is, you can do that. The innovate is you have on-prem applications which are not cloud ready, so you might have to refactor, rehost, those kind of things, make them like modernized for the cloud, which does take a lot of time. The easiest way is to do a lift and shift and a migrate to the environment, which is not always very efficient and effective from a cost aspect, but that's the easy way of moving into the cloud. Then we come to the governance state. The governance state, in my opinion, is the most important of the cloud adoption framework. And here's the reason why. In the governance state, you ensure that you have defined the environment to make sure that you are following the industry standards and regulatory compliance requirements. Plus, from a governance standpoint, you are going to define policies, permissions. Governance also going to look at cost, how cost is going to affect. So that is a critical piece in my opinion. And lastly, manage. So manage actually tells you how you conduct your operational environment in the cloud. So what that means is basically, let's say, for example, how are you going to be patching your virtual machines? How are you going to be backing up your data? How are you going to restore data in case there is a disaster? What is the business continuity plan? So though all those things come under the manage phase of the cloud adoption framework. And keep in mind, this is a very iterative process. So doesn't mean you've done govern once and you're done with it. No, because cloud is ever evolving, you would be growing, more workloads are going to be coming into the environment. You need to go back to the drawing board and look at how are we going to be governing the environment, how are we going to be managing the environment, and then go from there. And it really depends from a company to company, because some companies, let's say if they're coming from on-prem environment into the cloud, that's going to be a different challenge versus if a company is going to be born in the cloud where they do not have anything and it's a green field space, they're just coming into Azure. So those companies are going to have a different challenge from a governance and management standpoint versus the people who are moving from an on-premises environment. So now now let's talk about Azure Landing Zone, why Azure Landing Zone and why it's important. So anytime you're building a structure, could be a house, building, a bridge, what have you, the biggest and important piece of that structure would be the foundation. You may want to make sure you have a solid foundation at the bottom to support that structure, that building, that bridge. And Azure Landing Zone does that for Azure. It is building the framework for Azure to make sure before you move into Azure, before you move any workload into Azure, or if you before you provision or spin up any environment, you have a solid Azure environment to make sure that you are ready to scale the environment from a security aspect, from a governance, networking, and identity. So we'll talk about that in the coming slide, but this is exactly what Azure Landing Zone does. It provides you a framework to make sure you have a solid foundation to move into Azure. So the next question is, how do you get started? So from an Azure Landing Zone, it's a very iterative process. There are multiple ways you can move into Azure. So let's take a look and see the design areas. Excuse me. There are multiple design areas, and these are all the design areas. And as I've mentioned before, I can take each design area and just cover and have a session on each design area because the design areas are very deep. But so let's talk about the design areas first. So first off, the first one is going to be the enterprise enrollment. So if you have a enterprise agreement, you will be setting up your Azure AD tenant, and then the enterprise enrollment is going to be aligned to that tenant. Excuse me. Then you have identity, and identity is really big for Microsoft. So Azure AD, which is the main identity used, you would be using that, and then the factor is going to be, is it coming from Office 365? Where is and how are you applying your RBACs, role-based access control? Because that really should be defined right off the bat, and that's one of the pillars, if you will, of the Azure Landing Zone. Then comes the resource organization. So from a resource organization, how are you going to be preparing your management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and then resources? Because that should be properly planned, because these include, so for example, your resource organization, you would define your naming convention. If you do not have a naming convention defined right off the bat, it's going to be hard to change. So, for example, if you have a resource group and resources, it's hard to change resource group's name and resources name. On the subscription level, yes, you can change subscription levels, naming convention names, and even on the management level, but that's going to be the challenge for you. So make sure you get a jump start on the cloud governance by preparing for proper resource organization early. Even the management groups, that's going to also define how your organizational structure is going to look like, depending on how big of an organization it is. Is it enterprise? Is it SMB? Some people in the organization might be doing all the roles. Some people might just only be doing some of these design areas. So it really depends how this is going to work. The other one is network topology and connectivity, which is very important. And I'll actually talk about this next because people don't think about network connectivity and topology right off the bat, which should be the case, specifically if you're coming from an on-prem environment. And here's the reason why. You cannot have an overlap from your on-prem public IPs to the Azure public IPs, because then because you have to do site-to-site VPN or express route, so that's going to be a major issue. So those things have to be planned properly. Secondly, how are you going to be assigning IPs? What kind of IPs are you using? What environment do you want? So networking actually plays a wider role there. Business continuity and disaster recovery, that is very important because although you're moving into Azure, you have to also understand what the regions look like. So for example, I am in Canada. Canada has two regions. One region, Toronto, is in Canada Central, and then the other region, Quebec City, is in which is called Canada East. The challenge with Canada East, the one in Quebec City, is it does not provide availability zones. So if that is your primary region, you won't be able to do availability zones. Then you have to properly plan how are you going to do disaster recovery, how is business continuing going to work, and are you going to be using the other region, or are you going to be going to another region for the other country? Because the other challenge is some companies can only keep data within their country region. So in my case, if I want to go to the US, that could be an issue. The other challenge is some of the services also might be not available. So I know that in Canada, we do not have the GPUs for virtual machine. If you want to use specific GPUs, we have to go to the US region. So you have to also look and plan ahead, because that's going to be very vital for your design planning. Then governance discipline, as I mentioned before, governance is going to be a key pillar for your landing zone. Because governance, what happens is you would start basically planning and deciding early on how your governance is going to look like, how security is going to look like. You'll have to have a security baseline. You'll have to have a compliancy policies. You'll have to have backup baseline. Cost management is going to come into governance. So a lot of things are going to play into governance. So, and there are going to be people outside of the IT environment or the Azure environment of people who are managing Azure who would come into play, excuse me, from a governance standpoint. So that's why I said governance is the most critical piece from not only from a cloud adoption standard framework, but from a landing zone piece as well. The other piece is keep in mind, and I've mentioned this before, governance is iterative. It does not end. It's not like you've written it once and then it's not going to change. It is going to change as you introduce new services, new policies. So yeah, that's going to be the biggest challenge from them, because each service is going to have its own requirement of governance, own sets of rules, compliances, and whatnot. And lastly, the operational baseline. So really get a jump start on the operational baseline by preparing each landing zone for visibility, operational compliance, and for product and recovery process. So for example, operational baseline, how are you going to be backing up your virtual machines? How are you going to be patching up your virtual machines? If you're moving to a PaaS model, platform as a service, so let's say if you're running Azure SQL managed instance, MI, how are they going to be backed up? Are you replicating them to a different region or not? How are they, what is the RTO, RPO on that? So these are all the things that have to be planned and operationalized in this phase. Some of them, like RPO and RTO, can also be planned in the business continuity and disaster recovery phase, but operation-wise, this is going to be really the meat of where you would be executing the plan. So this has to be well documented, and then this should be well planned as well. So now let's take a look at the network decision guide, which is really important. So as I mentioned before, if you are coming from on-prem environment, you'll have to plan networking very well. And the reason being is, if you have an on-prem environment, you are going to say, okay, I have an on-prem environment. Do I need a express route or do I need a VPN connection? And that's going to basically be based on your environment. For medium to small businesses, I can say, you can get away with VPN gateway, but for large enterprises, you'll have to probably have an express route. With express route, it comes with much more complexity. You have to take a look at BGP. The other thing is, if you're getting express route, are you going to have multiple express routes for backup, or as a backup, are you going to be doing a VPN gateway, like site-to-site VPN? So those are really design questions that should be thought through from the get-go. The other thing is, if you're enterprise, you might already be using your own firewall. So let's say you're using Palo Alto or Cisco firewalls, what have you, and then you're going to be bringing them as the employees network as a network appliance into Azure. How is that going to work? Plus, are you not going to be using Azure Firewall now? So those design decisions have to be looked into consideration. Now, the other question is, what about VNet peering? If you want to access other resources in other resource groups within the same region or other regions, you probably need a VNet pairing. How is that going to work? The other one is the app gateway. If you have an application facing the internet, would you need a WAF, web application firewall, for that? So these are all the considerations that you would need. The other one is the IP address, the CIDR. Are you going to be using a /16 for your IP addressing or a /24? How many IPs do you need? You want to make sure you do not overlap your on-prem private IP to the Azure private IP, because otherwise you'll have a lot of conflicts and issues with connectivity. So these are all the things that have to be planned, that have to be considered to make sure that your network is robust. Are you going to be using a virtual WAN? And then from a topology standpoint, are we using a hub and spoke? And why do you want to use a hub and spoke? So those things have to be ironed out from the get-go. And that's where really the landing zone comes into play. And hopefully you are realizing that, yes, this is the reason the landing zone is very important, because we are kind of establishing all these standards before we move our workloads into Azure. The other thing is about DNS. What are you going to be using, your own DNS, or are you going to be using Azure DNS? So those are the things that have to be talked about and discussed and planned before you even move into Azure. So now let me move into the next phase, which is going to be the RBAC. So from an RBAC standpoint, Azure Azure role-based access control. So as I mentioned, this is part of the identity management. So what is going to happen here? You can segregate the duties with your team and grant them amount of access which they require. So the best thing, and we do this on-prem as well, we start with least privilege, right? Start with the basic amount of access, and then you can go up. So from a security principle, there are multiple objects. The security principle, represents a user, group, service principle, manage identity, and based on the use case, you would use that. I personally don't like to use the user security principle just because it becomes a management overhead and nightmare where a person leaves, then you have to go individually and remove them, for example. The other thing I also don't like is from the built-in roles, I stay away from assigning people the owner or contributor roles. Yes, if there's a reason, then absolutely do it, but there are other roles as well. So for example, if a person needs to back up a virtual machine or do patch management, so assign the backup operator role or even the virtual machine contributor role. That actually is minimizing the risk footprint there. You're not basically giving the keys to the kingdom and saying, okay, yep, you're the owner, you have the owner role, you can do whatever you want. So that's going to be also very important to make sure that you limit the roles. And then the scope. You define the scope on a subscription level, resource group level, or resource level. And the beauty of this is it's it's in a hierarchy, meaning if you assign it to subscription level, the assignments are going to trickle down to resource groups or resources. So that absolutely is going to be very important and very good. So now let's take a look at tagging and why tagging is very important. So one of the good things about tagging is you have to, or rather, why use tagging? So there are multiple reasons why you would use tagging. So one of the biggest reasons I've seen is for business processes, and then for revenue accountability or cost accountability. What I mean by that is, let's say if you want to do a chargeback to your internal department, tagging is the perfect example. So let's say you have a department who are running function apps for an application for a use case, and you want to charge them back for those resources. You would be using tagging to charge them back. Now, if you're an enterprise customer, you probably have third-party softwares where you can do that. But with tagging, that's the best way of doing it. You can make sure you can basically use tagging to tag resources because sometimes what happens is you do not have all the resources in the same resource group or in the same region as well. So if you are doing tagging, that's going to help you, lump all those resources together when you want to basically define how the process, or you want to basically say, okay, if this is against a project and whatnot. So the best thing about tagging is when you are defining tagging, define a naming convention. Pick a naming convention, and actually Microsoft has best practices. It defines and it tells, and we'll see that in the next slide, where it says, okay, define standards, and then you can do tagging. One thing I do want to mention here is data classification, which is not really looked upon, is you should have a tag for data classification specifically. And data classification is coming very important now because everybody's moving to the cloud. So you might have public data, private data, confidential data, and then critical data. And then you don't have to use all of them. You can use some of them, but the point being is have a data classification tag, which is going to be very, very important. So now let's take a look and see from a tagging standpoint. So if you need to break it down to the cost dimension, such as cost center environment, what you can do is you can define a role with the appropriate permissioning. And then you can always assign tags. So the tags could be an owner, could be a department, because you might have multiple departments. Now, environment is interesting because depending on the company, what I've seen is some companies from an environment standpoint, they say, we only have production and non-production. Some companies, they say, okay, under the non-production, we are going to break it down either further into test and dev, UAT, those kind of things. So it really depends on your company, what you want to do and how you want to do it. Some companies actually have a tags for projects because it's basically for a specific project they're doing, and then it goes back to a cost center after the project is done. So there are multiple, as they said, there are multiple ways of skinning the cat. It really depends on how you are going to be using tags and how this is going to be leveraged in your environment. And then this should be done to make sure that it really makes sense for you. And these are, if you look at the links, these are the links that provide the best practices on using resource tags. And then there are also custom RBAC roles that you can use. So from a resource aspect from networking RBAC naming conventions, so basically when you are defining the landing zone, this should be done. So RBAC should be defined upfront. As I mentioned, networking should be defined upfront, and the naming and tagging should be defined upfront. As I've mentioned, governance is an iterative process. You do need to have some kind of governance, but that should be not the higher priority. So what we've seen is when we're deploying a landing zone, these three would be the highest priority, I would say. Also, I would add Azure policies to this list. And then this should be on a lower priority because you do need these to begin migrating your environment into Azure. This can actually come into play because this is always going to be iterative process. Not that this is not like networking. Once you're done, it's not going to change much. Naming convention, once you've set up, it's not going to change much. Yes, it's going to change if you introduce more workloads or whatnot, but it's not going to change much. So RBAC, you've already defined how RBAC is going to work. Now, it's a management, or it's a matter of operating how you do RBAC. So that's not going to change much. But from a governance standpoint, it's going to change as people come and go, as organizational structure changes within the company. That might happen too. Today, your IT department might be decentralized. In the future, it becomes centralized. Now, governance is going to change. Security is going to change. For your environment, security might be handled by a totally different security department completely, and Azure security might come into under their umbrella. So that's going to be a different governance versus if somebody has all security on-prem, or if somebody has just on-prem security under them, and then Azure security is going to be taken care of by the Azure team. So that's going to be a different governance. So you really need to define how these things are going to work. So addressing them upfront is absolutely critical for the success into the getting into Azure. So these are the factors really that influence the right setup. So the first thing is going to be setting up cost structure that reflect. So what you can do, and there are policies, so you need to start setting up policies where people can only deploy resources in a specific region. So let's say for me, since I'm in Canada, I say, okay, only allow resources to be provisioned in the 2 Canadian regions. Anything else should be denied by policy. Same thing, there should be a list of approved services that should only be allowed. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions, depending on the use case, depending on the workload, depending on new scenarios and projects. But nobody should be just going out and start spinning up VMs, and then at the end of the month you get a bill. You're like, what happened, and why is the consumption so high? So and that's coming back to my point of governance. These things have to be placed before you really start going into Azure. The other thing is role and responsibilities. Who has access to what, and why do they have access to it? As I mentioned, minimal access level to carry out tasks. It should have the least privilege of any access. And then you also have to consider into third-party aspect too. What are the compliances and securities you are going to be taking? Are you using a third party to monitor your environment, or are you going to be using Azure Monitor to do that? So you have to start thinking from that side of things. From a security aspect too, MFA should be enabled for all the admins. So global admins by default have to have MFA enabled, but moving forward, you should also enable MFA for all the users now. So that should also be planned. Obviously, that's not going to happen day one, but that should be in the plan. So as security has become paramount, these should be things that should be taken seriously. So coming back to my point before, I said, okay, when we talked about the design areas, how do you want to really define your organizational structure? So anytime you spin up a new tenant, you would get the root management group. So this would be your root management group. Under here, you can have sub management groups. These are subscriptions. Under subscriptions, you'll have resource groups and then resources. Now, depending on your company, what you can do is you can separate out the root management group and have a sub management group for your core services. Would be, and then you can also have management groups for different line of businesses. You can apply tagging to any resources, and then you can apply policies as well. So those are important pieces to know. So the foundation of, and then from a governance standpoint, so governance is, I wanted to have this in here because from a governance standpoint, governance, a management group is the highest level. Then you have the subscription level, and then you have the resource groups and then the resources as well. Under management, you can have multiple subscriptions as well. But I do not recommend having a lot of subscriptions. It gets messier fairly quickly. So limit the number of subscriptions and limit the number of management groups, just to make sure that you can manage them properly. Here's a design consideration for organizational structure. So if, as you see, if you are a service process design model, you have the account, and then you have the subscriptions here. So development subscriptions, lab subscription, QA subscription, and then production subscription. On the other hand, if you have an organizational unit design, you can have an HR, accounting, and marketing. So it really depends how you want to do this. What are the things you're looking for? Meaning, how is your organization going to be defined? And actually, let's talk about that here. So these are the questions that I want you to answer, because who will be responsible for creating subscriptions? Actually, that's one of the biggest questions that is also becoming into consideration from a governance standpoint, and that's how you're going to be assigning the RBACs. What resources will be in the subscriptions by default? So that's also going to be defining how you basically have, or how many subscriptions do you want in there? Do you want single subscriptions, or do you want to have multiple subscriptions in there? So if I go back, if I take a look and see, okay, do you want to have one subscription and then lump everything there? Or do you want to break it down by department or by line of business? Or you can even break it down by production and non-production. So you can have a management group here, and then you can break it down by production and then have all the production subscription under that. And then you can have a non-production and then have all the non-production subscriptions there. So it really depends how you want to do it. It depends on the requirements. It depends on how big is the organization. It depends on how you want to manage the environment. So for example, if your IT department is decentralized, what you can do is you can create a core management group. Under that, you can even have a security management group and then move all subscriptions there. So yeah, it really depends on how you want to do that. And then here's the questions that you should be asking, and this is part of the exercise for this session. Got homework for you guys, if you will. So, there are limitations on subscriptions. So know what are the limitations and how, and then defining security or separation of duties. Who's going to be doing what? Dev, test versus production, different end customers. Because what I've seen is a lot of companies, specifically if they're a ISV, they might have one tenant and then they might separate out customers based on different resource groups or subscriptions. So it really depends on how you want to do it. That's going to be based on that. You can even have different subscriptions for projects or line of businesses. As I mentioned, don't make it complicated. You want it to keep it very simple or high level, but that's how, these are the best practices. So define your hierarchy based on organizational environment type. So as I mentioned, production, development, and then QA. And then under production, you'll have the mission critical protected environment, all that. Under development, you can have this. And then what I would even do is create a core services, and Microsoft actually does recommends this based on the CAF, Cloud Adoption Framework, and the best practice landing zone is to create a separate management group just for core services, where you would have networking, security, what have you. And then my recommendation is to align the policies on the management level I've seen customers put policies on subscription level. The challenge is if you're deleting those policies or making changes, then it's not, it's because it's on subscription level, it's not going to affect the other subscriptions. So if you have a policy here and then you're making changes, it is going to come down to this level. So it's much better from that aspect. And then finally, from a governance MVP standpoint, basically this is what it should be done. So the business unit, you can even split it out into geographical locations of the environment, production and non-production environment. This is production, non-production. So this could be the main environment of the, or this could be the main geography. So this could be maybe for me Canada Central, this could be Canada East, and then trickle down based on that. So it really depends how you want to do it. There should definitely be thought into it, because I work with customers. They started with Azure without any planning, and they did not have a lot of thought put into it, and they had a lot of subscriptions. So each subscriptions for each application, that was way too much. And some people I saw, they were lumping together prod and non-prod together. So from a policies and tagging and all those things also made it challenging. But that's why I said you have to put a lot of time and effort, and the planning has to be in there. So now let's talk about Azure Blueprint. I'm not going to go too much into this because this is still in preview. Microsoft hasn't made this GA. I don't know when this is going to be GA, but the amazing thing about Azure Blueprint is it helps you deploy and update the cloud environment in a repeatable fashion, because of the it has artifacts, and you can repeat from one environment to another. So it makes your life way easier. And then it provides you, and then because you would define all these things upfront, the ARM templates, the resource groups, what have you, and then with the Azure Blueprints, you're like, yep, go and make this a repeatable process for us. So as I mentioned, Landing Zone sits at the ready state of the cloud adoption framework. And if you look at this diagram from here, from an architecture complexity, we're starting from the least to going for the most piece. So for example, take a look at networking. Networking can get very complicated very quickly. Let's say if you have a small environment, if you're just doing a VNet, and then you're just doing site-to-site VPN, that is going to be a fairly easy or non-complex environment, rather than if you're doing an express route and if you're introducing an Azure firewall versus just doing NSGs. Once you introduce the Azure firewall, you have to start thinking a lot more how things are going to play. Whereas if you're just blocking everything on the NSG level, then it's an easier environment. So I would say start small and then go from there. Even from a compute storage standpoint, even identity, those are things that should be those are paramount. Policies, compliance requirements, you would need policies. It's the least amount of complication, but you need to define policies right off the bat. As I mentioned, what a couple of policies that I do recommend personally is limiting provisioning resources in all the regions, limited to whatever regions you have. Limit the VM size, so limit it to a family, maybe a D series, and say, okay, under D series, for example, limit to these, rather than people just spinning up different series of VMs, D, F, what have you, and then it becomes hodgepodge. And then also make sure the policies are implemented. Obviously, some of the policies would not all policies can be denied. So some of the policies, you have to make sure that they're in audit mode, because not everything can be denied, and there are going to be exceptions as well, depending on the environment. So consider the implementation of Landing Zone into 3 categories, hosting, Azure fundamentals, and governance. So from a hosting standpoint, and this is very basic concept, is, compute, storage, networking. These are the 3 main pillars of cloud. So regardless of which cloud you go, compute is always going to be there. Storage and networking is always going to be there, because networking is the main structure and platform, and storage is needed. And then from a Azure fundamental, we'll see how the resources, organizational resources, are a building block, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And then from a governance standpoint, I've been saying this the entire slide, that governance is the main pillar for your Landing Zone environment. So from a recommendation, best practices, the Azure Foundation is there. You have networking, you have identity and access management, which is going to be your RBAC, which includes RBAC, the storage databases, and cost management. Cost management is going to be huge, because when you're moving to the cloud, you want to make sure you start small, and then cost doesn't get out of hand. I've done multiple webinars, or actually sessions, on cost management. So if you want to listen to any of my sessions on cost management, check out my blog. The links are there, because cost management is really top of mind for a lot of people, especially who are fairly new to the cloud. And then deploy the policies. You can deploy, there are multiple ways of deploying policies. You can do it through Azure Policy. You can do it through Azure Blueprints. So there are different ways, and I'm not going to go much more into detail of the process, because each company is going to have a different process. But I want to also kind of mention what I said before, is allow Azure region for resources and resource growth. So, these are the things that you need to have. So these are great policies to have. And one of the ones I did not mention is tag. So you should really have a policy, Azure policies, where it should assign a tag or force a tag whenever you're spinning up a new resource. So for example, anytime you're spinning up a new virtual machine, a tag should be assigned to it. So that should be a policy there. So let's talk about Azure policy, and then so what are the benefits, right? So Azure policy, you do it in real time and at scale. And then the beauty of Azure policy, when you log in, you'll see a compliance. So it's going to tell you, okay, these are the policies that are in compliance. These are the policies which are not in compliance. And then based on your own compliance, you can kind of take a look and see and how you really want to manage Azure policies. So Azure policies, you can do, these are some of the scenarios what you can do with Azure policies. I've actually also already gone into a couple of policies, but There's so many that I know, as I mentioned, I can probably do a entire session on Azure policy, but start with the basic policies. You need to define some basic policies to make sure your environment is up to par. And what I want to do or call out with Azure policy is start with the audit policy. So do not go right into deny. I was working with a customer, like, we want to start denying everything. I'm like, yeah, but the problem is if you deny everything, you would not know how the policies are being affected. So what you need to do is start with audit mode and then start denying in an iterative process and understand the impact. So for example, you can start denying regions and saying, okay, yep, you can only spin up VMs or resources, what have you, in this specific region, and let that impact show on there, right? Because if you do everything denied, then that's going to be a lot of challenges for you. So roll out remediation in stages. And that brings us to our session, the Azure Landing Zone session. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you really enjoyed the session. I really enjoyed the talk, and then hopefully you learned quite a bit from this session as well. So thank you so much for your time.